this cruise missile test, a cruise missile test by itself is no big deal. India has tested cruise missiles before. Testing a missile is no big deal. But the fact that the missile was tested successfully and at its maximum range, by the way, which has not been reported just yet, of 1,000 kilometers or more, using an Indian designed, Indian made, Indian produced, Indian tested, combat turbofan engine is like a huge layer of ice cream on this cake. The testing of its hypersonic glide vehicle, the testing of this new hypersonic weapon, where the propulsion system, I have to admit, is still a bit of a mystery. People are still...
I was going to ask you that.
People are still speculating as to what is this? Is it a rocket motor? Is it a quasi-ballistic missile? Is it a short-range ballistic missile system? Nobody really knows just yet. The laboratories doing these tests, which come under the DRDO, are very, very secretive. You never really see these scientists out there and these aerospace engineers out there. So I applaud them because they live lives of a great deal of secrecy between Bengaluru, Hyderabad and the APJ Abdul Kalam Islands off the coast of Odisha. It's amazing work that they're doing. Believe me, they get a lot of flack. We've given them so much flack here, right? Saying that, when they fail and they should be called out. But in equal measure and with equal sort of emphasis, I'd like to say, when they succeed, I think they deserve a great deal of applause. On this podcast, our listeners have gotten used to, Dev and Shiv calling out all the areas where India has not been prudent in defense. And no regrets. I stand by all of the things that we've called out here on this podcast. But when it comes to missiles, partnerships, projects, etc., especially international projects, the prudence that the system has shown, and this is not just this government, earlier governments too, the LRLACM, the BrahMos are all from earlier governments, are extremely smart decisions.
Hello and welcome. This is the 47th episode of In Our Defense. Hi Shiv, what a week it has been when it comes to the world of missiles, if you were to talk about in the world of defense. But how have you been?
It's been an incredibly intense week for missiles, not just here in India, but also between Russia and Ukraine. And I have a feeling that, during the course of our conversation today, we'll also get some more information about another missile test, very, very interesting missile test that's planned for, probably this weekend, Dev, which is going to be a first kind of thing. So when this episode actually goes out, hopefully we'll have some breaking news about a missile that's going to be tested from the East Coast.
Wow, thanks for the heads up. So Shiv, before we begin this episode, I think a note for our listeners and viewers, we'll have the links in our show notes. You should really listen to our episodes, the 6-month-old episode on cruise missiles, the BrahMos project, and the recent one on the hypersonic missiles, because that is where Shiv really talks about the tech behind cruise missiles, how cruise missiles are different from the nuclear missiles that people normally associate with when they talk of missiles usually happens. So the tech behind cruise missiles is in the 6-month-old episode, and what are hypersonic missiles, how they are gonna bring a new chapter to modern day warfare is in the recent episode. We'll have the links in the show notes, and I really recommend that our listeners and viewers listen to those episodes or watch those episodes before you begin on this one. So yeah, you're right. When we planned this episode, actually we're running a couple of days late in terms of recording our episode. But when we planned it, we were gonna focus on that only, actually. Two missile launches, test launches that India has done over the course of the last 1 week. But Russia has added, like you said, a new dimension to it. More than Russia, it is the US, actually. Biden is about to leave the White House, and he seems to be handing Donald Trump, a very war that's going to be on its edge, with the US allowing what's known as the Army Tactical Missile System. So it's allowed Ukraine to use this for the first time ever in the last 1,000 days of the war, to fire long-range missiles into Russia. Russia has seen that as a threat and has seen that as sort of NATO kind of actively taking part in the war. And there are some murmurs here and there of nuclear weapons being used, because Putin, I think a couple of days ago, signed a change in his nuclear doctrine, not his, Russia's nuclear doctrine, kind of lowering the threshold for Russia to use.
And they've just launched
ICBM,
non-nuclear ICBM into Ukraine.
Yes, it just happened like an hour ago before we began this recording. So we won't talk about that, but I was just bringing that into context of why I think our conversation today is going to become even more interesting. What we are going to talk about is cruise missiles. We have actually talked about cruise missiles around 6 months ago. we focused mostly on the BrahMos, the
Yeah.
India's pride, and like I think if I remember the words you had used last time, sort of a heart touching and warming sort of feeling you get when you talk about the BrahMos missile project and
Yeah.
how sort of successful it has been over the course of decades being developed and used in India. That's obviously going to come up during our
Yeah.
conversation today because I think the BrahMos system and the tech behind the BrahMos system is kind of spawning off the several missiles that we're going to talk about this week. So before we get into our hard discussion, we'll talk about the two test launches that happened. On November 12th was the first launch of a long-range land attack cruise missile, LRLCAM. Uh, Very nicely, the PIB calls it a Defense Acquisition Council approved, acceptance of necessity sanctioned mission mode project.
Yeah.
Amazing set of words. Uh, the very crucial bit, which we'll get into detail in a bit on the maybe in a later in this episode, is that this missile had a Indian turbofan engine. It's called the Manik small turbofan engine. We'll talk a lot about this engine and also the propulsion systems that are used on cruise missiles, but in a bit. But obviously, you can bring that as you explain this test launch to us. The second test launch happened a few days later, on November 16th, if I'm not wrong,
Yeah.
of a long-range hypersonic missile. Again, a topic that we've covered just a few
Yeah.
episodes ago when we talked about Iran using it in the Middle East crisis. Uh, Before we talk about propulsion systems that are used on these missiles, the kind of the tech behind these missiles, what they will do to India's arsenal, and just about India's cruise missiles program and its future in general. Tell us about these two tests. What are these missiles exactly? Were they just sort of demonstrative launches, or were they like test launches to of the kind that this is gonna be in service very soon? I
Hmm.
think the word soup that PIB used for the first
Mission
launch,
mode.
yeah, mission mode, kind of gives me an impression that it's gonna be in our arsenal very very soon. The second one perhaps could have been a test of like
Yeah.
technology and stuff like that. What do you have to tell us about these two
So
launches?
both these missile tests were extremely significant, Dave, and the reason why, let's take them one at a time. Like you said, the two missiles that were tested about 4 or 5 days apart. The first one was a 1,000 kilometer range subsonic, which means slower than the speed of sound, long range land attack cruise missile, and the other is basically a long range hypersonic missile. Uh, the both of these tests have had nothing to do with each other, but the fact that they came just 4 days apart sort of raised the temperatures dramatically. People called it Missile Week, and there was a lot of celebration happening on social media, justifiably so, because it's both of these are far more complicated missiles than the usual testing that one sees. Usually when you see a missile being tested by India, it's something from the Agni
Yeah.
series or a ballistic missile. But every time there's a cruise missile or a different kind of missile, in this case a hypersonic missile, it is definitely an occasion to sit up and take notice and celebrate. So let's take them one at a time. The long range land attack cruise missile, which is basically a missile that was earlier called the Nirbhay.
Yes.
This is a modified version of that. Is a missile that has a range of about 1,000 kilometers. It's a cruise missile, pretty stealthy, flies at low level, can be launched from either land or sea. It's remember that in the acronym that you just read out, Dave, it's long range land attack cruise missile, LRLACM, and land attack. Doesn't just mean surface to surface, but it means sea to surface. From a ship to the surf to to attack a land target. So therefore, this is a missile that's going to be definitely a naval missile, and that's what's going to give it its real edge. The reason why it's a mission mode missile is because the Indian national security establishment, when the conflict with China in Ladakh started, it realized it didn't have this kind of a long range delivery system. It has ballistic missiles, but it doesn't have cruise missiles, which are significantly more difficult
Yep.
to detect and intercept using anti missile systems, and therefore it was a kind of all systems go. हमें ये चाहिए बहुत jaldi. You already have tested the Nirbhay. Get this done. It needs to be done very quickly. The Nirbhay cruise missile, which is not in service yet, is powered by a Russian NPO Saturn turbofan engine. But the Indian military was very, very insistent and very eager that the final product, which we now refer to as the LRLACM, which was tested on November 12th, be powered by an Indian engine. The reasons for that are, we've spoken about it endlessly on episodes of in our defense, which is that if you have an engine, you have the soul and the brains of a weapon system, an aircraft, etc., and therefore it is worth a country's time to invest money, human power, resources in perfecting that engine. A turbofan engine is a very complicated system, as we've seen with the Kaveri,
Yes.
which has not succeeded. But the Manik turbofan engine, which is basically a miniaturized turbofan engine, if you take think of the kind of engine that powers a fighter aircraft, it's a fairly large, complicated turbofan engine, which usually sits near the back of the aircraft with a nozzle for thrust. Now, if you take that huge, complicated engine and sort of make it very, very compact, make it thinner, make it smaller, make it basically a miniaturized engine, which comes with its own complications because you need power, but you also don't have that much space, etc. And small enough to be able to power a missile, not an aircraft, but a missile. You've achieved a big thing. And I think I'm glad you asked about the Manik engine, because this cruise missile test, a cruise missile test by itself is no big deal. India has tested cruise missiles before. Testing a missile is no big deal. But the fact that the missile was tested successfully and at its maximum range, by the way, which has not been reported just yet, of 1,000 kilometers or more, using an Indian designed, Indian made, Indian produced, Indian tested, combat turbofan engine is like a huge layer of ice cream on this cake. It's everything about this test. The missile itself is a known quantity. We know what this missile can do. We know what its range is. The different kinds of warheads have already been planned, etc. But the engine was the main variable in the equation, and that's been nailed now. This was not the first test of it, even though the press release says maiden test. It's the maiden public test that's been acknowledged. There have been tests before this, but hats off to the team that made the Manik engine, because they've basically succeeded where many other teams attempting similar kinds of technology have failed for various reasons in the past. So that is the LRLACM. So that's the long range land attack cruise missile. It will be a land launched and ship launched missile. Potentially could be even air launched, because at one point of time an air launched version of the Nirbhay was also in discussion. I remember doing an interview with the DRDO many years ago where they were very keen, that the Indian Air Force was very keen to have an air launched long range cruise missile. One doesn't know if that can still happen, because remember, this cruise missile is a big bulky creature, right? And even though the Air Force has been able to navigate its way around having a big bulky cruise missile to carry around, they managed to do that with the BrahMos. So they've got Sukhoi 30 fighters that are capable of carrying one BrahMos missile. It's not clear yet whether the Nirbhay type cruise missile can also be modified similarly. Theoretically, it's definitely possible. It's desirable also, but one doesn't know if it will actually happen. Also, because the BrahMos is having its range extended now, so does it make sense to go for another missile? So that's one part of it. Now let's come to the slightly sexier test that happened. I mean, not to take away, I've told you what is sexy about the LRLACM. It's an Indian engine, fabulous, very, very sexy. Now let's come to the other one, because this was a missile, once again, not being tested for the first time. This is the fun part of missile tests, Dave. When you see a government press release about a missile test saying maiden test and stuff, fun fact, usually not the maiden test. Okay, it's usually the maiden test that they're willing to speak about. Okay, so that's what maiden test usually means in government parlance. This particular test was of a hypersonic, long range missile as well. Terrific. You had a press release where they talked about the range, which is rare. It usually never happens. Range is usually never spoken about. It said a 1500 kilometer plus range, hypersonic missile. And then you had that fabulous video and those images that came in. We know very little about this apart from some speculation and some conjecture. There are some who believe, and I also believe, that this is actually an iteration of what was earlier called the India's long-range anti-ship missile,
Right.
which means this particular missile is being built as a kind of big ship killer, an anti-aircraft carrier weapon, possibly. And the fact that it is hypersonic, which means able to achieve speeds upwards of Mach 5, 5 times the speed of sound and above, makes it virtually untouchable once it's been launched. It cannot be detected. It's so blindingly fast that it cannot be intercepted, and therefore it's if one of these gets launched, it's going to spoil your day, right? So there is some debate happening right now about the technology that's been used.
Right.
Is this a true blue hypersonic weapon in terms of it, being being a hypersonic glide vehicle, that attains those speeds across its entire journey towards its target, or is it a missile that at some point in its journey, whether ballistic or cruise, is able to attain hypersonic speeds. So there is a difference between the two things: a hypersonic weapon and a weapon that's able to, for a period of time, attain hypersonic speeds are two different things. But that doesn't really bother me right now because the weapon has been tested, which means it's out there. And if, as the government says, it's able to attain those speeds at any point during its entire flight path, it's a very, very big deal. It's a big technological achievement. We should also remember that India is also testing a true hypersonic weapon. Not saying this is not a true hypersonic weapon, but India is also testing something called the hypersonic, demonstration vehicle, HSTDV.
yes.
The full form I've forgotten, which is being tested separately. It's launched by a ballistic missile. We've spoken about it in a previous episode, and then it kind of pops out from the nose of that missile and then takes its own path. So India's journey towards hypersonic weapons takes a very big step forward with this test.
Yeah. Right. Tell us more about modern missiles in general,
Yeah.
because I'm guessing missiles evolved from the time when human beings used to throw spears, and they kind of evolved. A lot of people have played games like the Age of Empires, or the Age of Empire. I'm sorry. Then you had something that was like a catapult, which we should throw rocks and then incendiary items. Uh, and over the course of centuries, you've evolved. And very interestingly, when I was researching about the evolution of missiles, I came across the fact that there's an India link to some of the modern missiles that we see, which was the Mysorean rockets
Yeah.
in the 18th century, around the time of Tipu Sultan, who had used them against the British. And it was a British engineer who was named Sir William Congreve, who kind of got inspired by those Mysorean rockets and then kind of designed his Congrevian rocket, and that has sort of formed the basis of modern rocket missile tech, so
Yeah.
to speak.
Yeah.
But anyway, when people think of missiles, when I think of missiles, I think of just this, long conical sort of a thing that takes off from somewhere and just lands somewhere and creates destruction, right? But over the course of the various episodes that we've had, you've described missiles in very, very interesting ways. They are able to change course, they're able to maneuver themselves. In fact, if you look at photos of modern day missiles, all of them are just like, cylindrical items. Some of them have fins, some of them have wings. So I'm guessing they kind of come out of those compartments and then they reveal their actual true shape. So tell us about modern missiles. What are they all about? And is that plain Jane image of just like that conical sort of a rocket that is being launched from one place to the other? Is that how it is, or are they like something much more advanced that we can't even think of right now?
The one particular sort of perspective and narrative, they've, in the last 5 years, 5, 6 years, had basically said that the era of missiles is probably ending
Yeah.
because of what is called directed energy
Yes.
weapons. Lasers and microwaves and sort of focused heat weapons that are capable of affecting the same kind of damage on your adversary or an incoming projectile without the need of a projectile, that kind of thing, laser weapons. But I think the Russia-Ukraine war has just reminded the entire world that missiles are going nowhere. When it comes to nuclear deterrence as well, the only sort of credible delivery system is a missile, whether it is air-launched or sea-launched or land-launched. It's ultimately going to have to be a missile to do the dirty work of a nuclear attack. But even in a conventional even a conventional sort of war like what's happening between Russia and Ukraine right now, uh, even if you look at what's happening between Israel and Iran, it's clear that these are missile fights. A large part of what's happening are projectile fights. These are not troop versus troops. This is not trench warfare. There's very little. There's very little tank warfare as such going on. Even in Russia and Ukraine, even though there are a lot of tanks, there's no tank warfare going on. There are no tank battles. All of it is very, very missile centric. The Russians are using cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. Like you said, the Ukraine has just been cleared to use the Army Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS. They've couple of days ago they've started using the Storm Shadows,
Yes.
which are basically the Scalp cruise missiles, which the Indian Air Force also has. And therefore, whether it comes to drones or whatever it is, ultimately those cylindrical objects that you mentioned uh, qualitatively have not changed very much at all. They've changed dramatically in terms of their range. They've changed enormously in terms of their abilities to evade detection. They've changed dramatically in terms of how smart they are in terms of guidance. Uh, uh, when we talk about drone warfare, what is a drone but a highly maneuverable and intelligent missile? Even a drone, even an attack drone is ultimately just a missile that you're remote controlling with a greater degree of accuracy. You're able to make it fly around for a bit before actually coming down and impacting its target. So therefore, missiles have changed dramatically. In a previous episode, we talked about loyal wingmen.
Yes.
People flying fighter planes not having to actually launch missiles themselves. They'll have loyal wingman drones doing the dangerous work of launching those missiles. So in all these aspects, missile warfare has changed, but the essence of it continues to remain the same, which is that in a war, in a battle where adversaries are far apart, you're going to need projectiles in order to manifest your will, your imposition of destruction on your enemy. And the only way to really do that is either send your armies into that place, which most people don't want to do, or you have missiles.
Right. Let's move our focus to what we said at the beginning of this episode. We'll talk majorly about is the propulsion systems
Yeah.
on these missiles, especially the two missiles that were launched, and just generally the work that India is doing when it comes to powering missiles and rockets. The reason I say we want to focus on that is, like you said in the first answer, that we have long mastered the warheads, whether they're nuclear or non-nuclear. I think you said that in a previous episode as well when we discussed India's ballistic missile program. That warhead, that nuclear test launch was done in Pokhran, done and dusted. You've managed that skill to develop a warhead that'll explode and bring hell to your enemy. Now comes the hard part of delivering that warhead to that particular region, particular target. There are many different ways. We spoke a lot about the ballistic side of things when we did that episode, which obviously we'll have a link in our notes. When it comes to the cruise missiles bit, you have the turbofan engine, the Manik turbofan engine that has been used by the LRLCAM that was test launched. I want you obviously to tell us about the journey that this engine has taken. First of all, where does the name Manik, for
Yeah.
example, come from?
Hmm.
Why is it called Manik, a small turbofan engine? And turbofan engine, like you said, but they power fighter jets. They also power like normal airliners, for example. And if you have the technology, you can obviously move on to developing
Yeah.
planes and drones and whatnot. So tell us about that, and then we'll obviously talk about the second propulsion system that is in focus today, the ramjet and the scramjet engines. But we'll come to that a bit later. Tell us about the journey of this particular turbofan engine and the other work that India is doing in terms
Yeah.
of developing power for its cruise missile programs.
It's a really important question, and I think it goes to the very heart of India striving to be independent in a core area which nobody really sees. You see the missile, you see the aircraft, you see the helicopter, but not very many people actually know that the propulsion systems of most of these things are not Indian.
Yes.
A thing that we should be very, very proud about is the fact that when it comes to rocket engines, rocket motors, India is completely self-reliant. All our ballistic missiles, all our rocket engines in ISRO are all Indian engines, Indian propulsion systems, and India has mastered rocket propulsion systems, which we don't need any help with. Even if we had help earlier, we don't need it. We haven't needed it for a very long time. So that's done and dusted. That's sorted. But like I said, a rocket engine is while hugely complicated, and one cannot take anything away from how complicated a rocket engine is. It is more rudimentary and simple than a cruise missile engine, which is either a turbojet or a turbofan engine. Simply because a turbofan engine has many more moving parts. A much higher degree of required reliability, a greater degree of variability in terms of performance requirements, and the fact that unlike a ballistic missile, which is powered by by multi-stage rocket motors or rocket engines, takes a ballistic path, which is a fairly predictable path once it's launched, with very little room for maneuver. There is some room for maneuver, but not very much. A cruise missile is basically a remote controlled aircraft. It's an aircraft that can, depending on what kind of engine it has, can fly either blindingly fast like the BrahMos, or it can be a fairly stable, slow kind of missile like the one that India has just tested. In either case, the engine is extremely important because it is basically giving the missile its speed and kinetic energy through its entire journey. Just think of 1,000 kilometers, Dev. It's an enormous amount of distance. Enormous distance. The scalp missiles that the Ukraine has just been cleared to fire into Russia has a range of somewhere between 300 and 500 kilometers, if I'm not mistaken. It's an air-launched cruise missile with a range of nearly 500 kilometers. Is colossal. It's a colossal, game-changing kind of weapons capability. But ultimately, you know, getting a missile to be able to maintain that kind of speed, kinetic energy, be maneuverable and guidable through that entire journey means it needs to have a reliable engine that is simply relentlessly, tirelessly pushing and powering that missile without any failure whatsoever. The smallest of failure means that missile drops out of the sky. And these missiles are not cheap. Okay. They are millions of dollars each. Each scalp costs like, $3-4 million a pop. So they're not cheap. So so everything comes down to the engine. The turbofan engine Manik, the name I'm sure is probably from some scientist who must have been involved with it during the initial stages. There are usually little inside things about these things. I'm not sure who exactly it's named after, but like for instance, Atal Bihari Vajpayee gave the Tejas its name.
Yes.
And there are various other. There's no real set protocol in terms of naming, but I imagine that the Manik gets its name from some big scientist on the team now or in the past. But the Manik represents, in my view, an incredible success of the Indian military research establishment. And the DRDO and our aerospace scientists and engineers get a lot of flack, most of it justified, with not being able to deliver, cost overruns, time overruns, not being able to give the customer what they want in a timely fashion. But the Manik turbofan engine is something that will go beyond cruise missiles.
Yes.
It means that they've mastered an art that has been elusive to India for decades together. it means that the same guys who've made the Manik can perhaps scale it up into bigger things. The Manik engine could be, if it is scaled up into a slightly more powerful power plant, it could potentially power India's combat drones in the future. It could power small aircraft in the future. There are export possibilities. There are all these things that happen once you're able to build engines. Look at the United States, the UK, France, Russia, the countries that have mastered the art of making jet engines. All aircraft in the world are basically powered by engines built by 4 or 5 countries, right? And all aircraft and all aviation carriers and all air forces are completely dependent on those engine suppliers. And it is not an ideal situation for India when it comes to weapon engines. And therefore the Manik is hugely important. When we come to ramjet and scramjet, which are your next generation, very high velocity weapons, India is taking extremely promising steps there. The testing of its hypersonic glide vehicle, the testing of this new hypersonic weapon, where the propulsion system, I have to admit, is still a bit of a mystery. People are still
I was going to ask you that.
people are still speculating as to what is this. Is it a rocket motor? Is it a quasi ballistic missile? Is it a short range ballistic missile system? Nobody really knows just yet. Nobody knows what kind of path the missile is taken because no information has been revealed, and I'm not surprised. It's a secretive weapon that the reality of which will come out a little later. But as a long range anti-ship missile, the not very much can actually be said about it at this point of time. But all of these tests, the Manik, the hypersonic missile, the BrahMos 2 whenever it comes, which is going to be a very advanced hypersonic missile system, basically means that India is kind of firing on all fronts, literally and figuratively. From your slow Manik to your hypersonics to your rocket motors to your multi-stage missiles. It basically means that India is taking no chances. It wants to be a master at all of these things. And I think fabulous, because if you have the engine right, you can just build anything over those engines. So that's what's working right now.
Yeah. Right. Good point about engines, because I think when we talked about the Tejas in one of our recent episodes, and especially the delay in the deliveries of the Tejas, I think they still haven't begun, by the way. The reason was, and the number one reason, there are other reasons as well, but the number one reason was the delay in the supply of engines from the US. And you had said even back then that if India had somehow managed to salvage perhaps the Kaveri engine project, maybe this perhaps would not be a day we would see. And like you said, if the Manik is kind of upscale, perhaps a future Tejas Mark II could be powered by that instead of maybe a US or a Western import. Though I think the timelines might not be that comfortable for the development to happen. Right. Yeah, so I was anyway going to ask about the scramjet, but like you said, because you've said it's taking very promising steps. So I think I guess I'll leave it at that, because I know that the BrahMos ramjet engine was actually developed with the help of Russian tech, but it's produced in India. But I'm guessing, like you said, we are taking some good baby steps.
All of these tests basically show that the steps that India has taken, are visible.
Yes.
These are not theoretical projects on some website somewhere or in a PDF file. We're literally seeing videos of those tests taking place, which is in my view is incredible, because these are, all these, the laboratories doing these tests, which come under the DRDO, are very secretive. You never really see these scientists out there and these aerospace engineers out there. So I applaud them, because they live lives of a great deal of secrecy between Bengaluru, Hyderabad, and the APJ Abdul Kalam Islands off the coast of Odisha. Highly classified projects, tests. The only time you ever hear that a missile test is going to happen is because of a notification or a NOTAM that's been issued, which you see on Twitter, which are OSINT analysts will put out saying missile test hone wala hai, abhi is range pe hone wala hai. Like I said, there's a new NOTAM that's out for the next few days, which seems to be a submarine launched ballistic missile.
Oh, is it that one?
So even greater degree of excitement, kya ye K4 hai, all that's happening right now. So it's it's amazing work that they're doing. Believe me, I mean, they get a lot of flack. We've given them so much flack here,
True.
right? Saying that when they fail, and they should be called out. But in equal measure and with equal sort of emphasis, I'd like to say when they succeed, I think they deserve a great deal of applause
Yeah.
because we can't name them, we can't show their faces, but they're doing fabulous work. Men, women, young Indians doing amazing aerospace engineering work in all these laboratories and getting these weapon systems out there, I think is really national service.
Yeah, I completely second that. And I mean, the missile program, whether it's the ballistic one or the cruise one, is the fabulous example of that. I think what you just said, and obviously we'll come back to that towards
Yeah.
the end of this episode. We'll now talk about what missiles India does have right now. The entire just cruise missiles, obviously, the entire cruise missile inventory, and what's gonna come up again in the future. But after a quick break.
I still remember the first time that I was told I am pre-diabetic. What am I doing wrong?
So the first thing to understand about why this is happening is to understand two factors. One is genetic, the other is the environment.
Are there some steps which you would say are essential for managing diabetes?
Lifestyle management is critical in management of diabetes, and it is important for people to know that diet and exercise do play a very important role in managing their glucose levels. Small simple steps, it's healthy, following a healthy meal plan and regular physical activity. Diabetes specific nutrition supplement in the form of oral supplement in consultation with a doctor for right nutrition could be one way of management of diabetes. Now, these are designed for diabetes, people with diabetes.
Take a few steps back and then lay what Purvi said a little more in context now. Some things have changed in our understanding of the management of diabetes. First thing is, I don't want to get into the big remission question, but we know that the key to managing diabetes is to help the patient lose weight first. And there the diet, and we know that this can be achieved without medications. And it can be achieved without surgery.
Welcome back. Shiv and I are discussing India's cruise missiles and the cruise missile program for the second time in around 6 months. This time in the context of two test launches of missiles that happened this week. Maiden launches on paper, but like Shiv said, these were not actually maiden launches. They were maiden launches for the public, which kind of explains the question I've always had: how come all these test launches never fail? It turns out there must have been some failed
Yeah.
launches, because obviously on a project like this, you will expect some practical failures when you go out and test something like this. But they only, I'm guessing, do that maiden public launch or test launch when they're fairly confident कि हाँ ये तो success ही होने वाला, so we can announce to the world कि bro, this is coming or we have this. So talking about we have this or this is coming, take us to the inventory that we have right now of cruise missiles. Once again, we'll avoid the ballistics missiles, because when you bring that in, then it becomes too much of things to talk about, and we've done a separate episode on it altogether. And we'll have a link to that in the show notes. Take us to the India's cruise missile inventory, and I think the best way for you to do that is the way we enjoy hypotheticals. Let's take a conflict, an all-out raging conflict with China. You have your land border, you have the skies, and you obviously have the Indian Ocean. You With the current crop of missiles that we have, what is it hypothetically that India can do? And then obviously, as you end it, tell us what's coming in this inventory in the future.
So, the first point that you asked, you mentioned in your question, Dave, about successful missile tests. Let me tell you that there have been missile test failures, even when it comes to India's cruise missiles.
Of course.
A couple of Nirbhay tests have quote unquote failed, and the reason why I say quote unquote failed is because there is actually no such thing as failure when it comes to testing. The whole point of a test is to see how things look when in an actual sort of active kinetic scenario. It's one thing to simulate missiles on a computer and look at them through CAD and engineering software, and fluid testing and things like that, wind tunnel testing and stuff. But when you actually fire it in the real world is when you learn something about it. So a famous missile scientist had told me this: there's no such thing as a failed missile test, because as a young reporter I had asked him once, but this failed or that failed. He said there's no such thing as failure. We will keep testing it. And I remember him telling me, I think it was an Akash test that had failed many years ago, failed, quote unquote. And he said, when it, as you say, failed, we learned something about the guidance system. We learned something about the motor. We learned something about certain procedures we were using while testing, which were perhaps faulty, which worked in simulation but didn't work in the real world. So we knew how to avoid those things in the next missile we build. So there is no such thing as a failure, because in a test, we're not firing that missile at somebody, right? We're testing it only for ourselves. So where that missile launches, lands, makes no difference. So that was a big learning for me. So very importantly, no such thing as a failed missile test. Everything is a learning, makes things better. The next time the missile tested, much more, many more learnings will go into it. So it's important. Now the India-China scenario. Again, the truth of the matter is that India, even when it comes to missiles, cruise missiles especially, has been playing catch up. Now, the bad news first, as always, and then I'll tell you why there's a lot to celebrate. When it comes to hypersonic weapons, even the United States acknowledges that China is at the forefront. Even the United States. The United States is a country which is not in second position in any form of warfare. Any form of warfare, missiles, aircraft carriers, nuclear, cyber warfare, data, whatever it is, any sphere of warfare, the United States is globally acknowledged as being numero uno, because they've got like a vaster defense budget than all other countries in the world put together, right? So for the United States to acknowledge that they're playing catch up with China when it comes to hypersonic weapons, should make all of us wonder, so where does that leave India then? We've just tested like a couple of hypersonic weapons, so where are we in this whole race? So that's the not so good news, that we're still playing catch up. But the fact that we're testing them and that we now have the technology to take things further means we're in this game. India is definitely in this game. Whether it's going to be an arms race, whether it's going to be a game of balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, India is in there. India is not going to have to, sit by the sidelines and watch and wait for some country to give us this technology, etc. We're in this game, so that's the good news. As far as cruise missiles is concerned, again, when one talks of weapons, we should always, contextualize what we're hoping to achieve with those weapons. Weapons ultimately are just a bomb attached to a rocket that's going to, spoil someone's day. It's going to destroy something at the end of its journey. Now, what are you hoping to achieve with that? Are you hoping to completely dissuade Chinese ships from coming at you? You've got BrahMos missiles. You've got BrahMos missiles that can be launched by Indian Navy ships. You've got BrahMos missiles that can be launched by Indian Air Force Su-30s that are stationed in Tanjavur in Tamil Nadu, which means that any Chinese ship that potentially tries to do anything funny in the Indian Ocean is going to be within possibly a target for a BrahMos missile. You've got the LRLACM missile that will come online. It's a mission mode missile, which means it has to come online not decade later, but within a few years. It's already been tested successfully with the Manik engine, which means all systems go. Maybe a few more tests and it'll be operational. What launch mechanism, etc. Those are things that will be easily sorted out. You've got those. You've got the Scalp cruise missile, which is already in service, operational with the Indian Air Force using its Rafale fighters. You've got the land-launched BrahMos missiles, which now have there's a program to extend their range beyond 300 kilometers. There's going to be an extended range BrahMos of it could go all the way to 1,000 kilometers if necessary with a new engine. You've got the hypersonic BrahMos 2, which is currently, if my information is correct, in the final stages of proof of concept and definition, etc. You should see that missile come online towards the latter half of this decade. So you've got, these are all your cruise missile systems that are there. Then you've got your ramjet, scramjet, engined possibilities that could come in the future. Hypersonic, cruise missile in the future, if the tests that are currently happening yield reliable technology as far as those propulsion systems are concerned. All of this means that the same kind of successes that India has had with ballistic missiles is very much within reach when it comes to the far more complicated science of cruise missiles. From Manik to hypersonics to ramjet, scramjet, whatever you're talking about. To repeat myself, India is literally firing in all those areas. China has missiles which it mostly reverse engineers from other countries, but the same kind of race that China is in with the United States, we don't sort of participate in that kind of global arms race that China is part of, with Russia and the United States. But for India's requirements, India's regional needs, and when we talk about regional needs, we're basically talking about China. We're not talking about anybody else. India either has weapon systems and doctrines, or is developing them at a reasonably good rate. There's a long journey to go. It's not like everything's hunky dory. We have everything we need. There are huge gaps, and we've discussed those when it comes to long range weapons, when it comes to air defense, when it comes to delivery systems, when it comes to the Navy itself. There are huge gaps, but things are moving well.
Yeah.
And there's reason for cheer when it comes to missile systems.
Yeah, right. To end the show, how do you, slightly abstract question, but still I'll go there. How do you see the legacy of the BrahMos project, the successful BrahMos project, and its impact on the ongoing, what's happened in the last few years, Indian missile research? Because I'll tell you something. When I was going through the list of missiles that India has, and I'm not just talking about cruise missiles right now. I'm even talking about something at the tactical level,
Yeah.
something that a unit in the army would use to like fire maybe 50 kilometers across, 100 kilometers across, stuff like that. A majority of it is Indian. You may have some Israeli systems, you have a couple of Russian systems, maybe something from Europe, but a majority of it, if I hazard a guess, it would be, I think, in the range of 80% is mostly Indian. Yes, like you've mentioned again and again, some of those systems might be Indian on paper, but there's some of the crucial elements would be foreign. But anyway, what I'm trying to get at is the BrahMos system, its success, how much of an impact it has had in terms of branching out into all these other missiles that we're so confidently doing that. And do you think we are able to avoid the mistake that the Indian Air Force has famously made of, having different aircraft types and with different engines and different spare parts and different mechanics and stuff like that? And with your missile systems, you have this one basic commonality that, you have the basic systems in place and you have various versions of it. Because when I was looking at the missile project, the Indian missiles, it kind of reminded me of what you once had described what would be an ideal scenario, that you have this one basic aircraft type for your Indian Air Force, and then you have different versions of those aircraft, different variants, so to speak. One that can do surveillance, one that can fire maybe bombs, sorry. The other could do something else and stuff like this, so on and so forth. Are we there, and are we heading there with missiles in India?
So it's a super important question, because this is something that faces the government every single day. Now there are two examples, live examples of partnerships between India and another country for a missile system that have been very, very successful. And when I say partnership, I don't mean technology comes here and we make it here and we produce it and we sell it, or induct it into the military. I mean a real sort of partnership in terms of joint development and joint production, where both countries' militaries then buy what is being developed. One of them is the BrahMos, even though there was a long lead time before the Russian military acquired the systems as well. The other is the Barak 2, which is an Indo-Israeli weapon system. In India, it's called the Long Range Surface to Air Missile. It's already in service with the Indian Navy. It's called the MR-SAM in the Indian Air Force and the Indian Army. Highly successful and proof of concept business models where two countries have come together, put their their know-how and their expertise in weapons development together, and produced a specific weapon for both countries' requirements. Now, the only problem with such partnerships, Dave, is that they are pretty unique. One would imagine, logically speaking, like you said, that okay, so this model works, so why can't we just expand it into other weapons and replicate this model elsewhere? It's the thing is, it's not that simple. It's not that simple. India has attempted to do make a similar model with France, didn't quite work out. India decided we don't need foreign help for certain things. Where India needs help, uh, like for example with the BrahMos, because there was no weapon like it anywhere in the world. With the LRSAM, it needed Israeli expertise because India was still having a little bit of trouble in terms of the more advanced systems required in surface-to-air missiles. It needed Israeli help. Israel was happy to get into a project with India. That spawned it. But in all other missile projects, especially like the ones we've discussed, India is fully confident of doing it alone. It doesn't need it doesn't need foreign help. B, it doesn't see the geopolitical value of a partnership in that particular sphere. The United States has offered India, partnerships in terms of co-development and co-production of certain missile systems, where India has said, no, we want to do this alone. We don't want to do it with somebody else. So India has been very, very prudent. On this podcast, our listeners have gotten used to, Dev and Shiv calling out all the areas where India has not been prudent in defense. And no regrets. I stand by all of the things that we've called out here on this podcast. But when it comes to missiles, partnerships, projects, etc., especially international projects, the prudence that the system has shown, and this is not just this government, earlier governments too. The LRSAM, the BrahMos are all from earlier governments. Are extremely smart decisions. This is India acknowledging that, we've got a good thing going when it comes to aerospace missile tech in this country. Now, we will be smart and decide to partner with somebody else when it comes to a certain amount of technology advancement that we are absolutely certain we can't do ourselves. Or we will partner up with them in terms of some types of technology and go, but largely do it ourselves. So I think missiles is one sphere where India takes each different requirement, each different missile on a case-to-case basis. It doesn't want to say, okay, LRSAM and BrahMos are there, let's just scale up this model and do all our missiles in this way because it'll just get done faster. India is protective about its own IP. Most people don't even recognize this when they talk about Indian weapon systems, and they say the wealth of intellectual property that Indian aerospace engineers and scientists have made through decades and years of expertise in missile science is something that nobody wants to acknowledge. Very few people want to acknowledge. This is incredibly priceless data and IP that India is sitting on. It's just a question of how much more we can leverage all of this. So other countries stand to gain from India's expertise, I would say.
I completely agree with that. And I think all your friends in the defense PRO business would really want us to always talk about missiles and not anything else. Because you're right, when it comes to the topic of missiles, you really can't find faults anyway. You really can't even find incidents, episodes. I'm pretty sure there must have been something that happened at a minor level, something that, didn't happen the way it should have happened, and stuff like that. Some over expenses here and there. But if you look at the broader picture, the larger picture, more or less you've got everything going right. Like you said, India is firing on all engines, and more or less achieving what it set out to achieve, and developing a good enough repository of missiles, a good enough arsenal of these weapons, some of which are of mass destruction. Which is the point I want to end this episode on. When you see how missiles have been used this year in actual life conflicts, it's sort of a very contrasting picture for me, because here we are sitting and talking about how these missiles can cause mass destruction, they will level places, they will kill hundreds and thousands of people. Yet you had Iran firing a barrage of missiles into Israel. Several of them were shot down. Many of them were cruise missiles. You've had Ukraine recently using the US missiles that it was authorized to by Biden, and then, like you said, the Storm Shadow missiles from the UK, firing them towards Russia. You had Russia responding just before we began recording this episode with ICBM. Like it sounds like, oh my god, once an ICBM is launched, that's it. War khatam, end of story, tata bye bye, end of the world, right? If it has a ballistic warhead, which in this case it did not yet. My point is, you don't really see a lot of damage. The target country will obviously always say, ki, haan, it just hit some building here and there, some stones here and then, nothing much happened. The attacking country will say, ki, our mission was fulfilled, what we set out to, we did. But even in the aftermath, days later, weeks later, you don't really see those satellite imagery, you don't really see actual hard pictures that show you mass destruction. The reason I'm asking is, look at movies. Look at something like, let's say, Iron Man. If you remember Iron Man, the movie one, when Robert Downey Jr., who plays Iron Man, trying to sell some missiles to the US military. He gave us this picture of an entire hillside being completely obliterated by a missile strike, right? You don't see that really happening in the real world. You also see a lot of these missiles being taken down.
Yeah.
The expenses get really, really high. There are questions already being raised, by the way, of how much Ukraine can spend on using the US missiles that it has been allowed. So when it comes to the reality of using these missiles and what happens in a real world conflict, how do you explain that? What's happened in the last 1 year?
Well, the short answer to all of this is that the reason why you don't see a great deal of destruction when you see missile exchanges is often because missiles are also a message. A missile is not just about affecting a huge amount of destruction at the other end. It's also basically telling your enemy country, I can reach you, which is what happened between Iran and Israel. Iran's missile barrage was designed in such a way as to basically tell Israel, all of your cities, all your air bases, all your population centers are within the reach of my missiles. Now, I'm launching all these missiles. I'm deliberately not launching them at places where anything is going to be destroyed because I'm sending you a message. Similarly with Israel, when it sends a whole bunch of missiles into Iran, you will see some damage, you will see some fires, but the missile is the message. Contrast this with Russia, Ukraine, where you do see large-scale devastation. There is no shortage of imagery of damage that has been caused by missiles. Not so much now, but in the first few months of the invasion and the war, the kind of hellscapes that have been created in different cities of Ukraine because of missile damage was very, very apparent, because at that point, Russia's message was very clear. It was to create a kind of shock and awe situation, daze Zelensky's Ukraine into submission, perhaps batter their cities, reduce their cities to piles of ash, which is what happened to many cities. And the destructive quality and impact of missiles was very visible there. But as the war wore on, it became a question of like, what is this destruction even achieving? Then it became about much more targeted strikes, not kind of bombardments, but much more targeted strikes of certain facilities, a nuclear facility, an energy facility, an electricity board office, those kinds of things, in order to try and cripple Ukraine in a more targeted sort of way. Similarly, with the drone attacks on the Kremlin, wherever they were actually launched from, the idea was not to destroy the Kremlin, but to tell Russia that my drones or my missiles can reach you where you are, so you are vulnerable, you are not completely safe. So I still say that we live in a world right now where we're seeing a lot of missile warfare where the missile is the message, and it's become about that. It's now about, you're not safe where you're sitting. You might think you're safe. You might think you've got your S-400s and S-500s and all your ballistic missile system, anti-ballistic missile systems, in full glare, and all your radars on, but my missiles can still reach you. That's what this is really all about. And I think that's something to be thankful for as well, because once missiles start being used with a huge amount of destructive intent, that is instantly escalatory.
Yep.
That becomes much more escalatory. Russia's use of an ICBM, you couldn't ask for a bigger example of missile as a message.
Yep.
An ICBM is technically a missile which has a range of tens of thousands of kilometers. 10,000 kilometer plus range is an ICBM. What the hell do you need a 10,000 kilometer range missile for? to hit Ukraine, which is your neighbor,
Yeah.
right? ICBMs are developed by the US, Russia, China to hit each other,
Yeah.
to hit each other, right? Or hit each other's bases in other continents. Intercontinental ballistic missile, not, India doesn't need an intercontinental ballistic missile to hit Pakistan, etc. Right? So, by the way, India doesn't even have an ICBM right now. We've got long range because who do we need to hit
Yeah.
with an ICBM? The guys we need to hit, we can hit with long range ballistic missiles, which we have right here, which are Pakistan and China, right? So I think the ICBM that's been used without a nuclear warhead, like
Yeah.
you rightly said, was not at all to cause any destruction in Ukraine.
Mm.
It was basically a message to both Zelensky, to NATO, and especially the United States, saying, "Hey, hello, I've got ICBMs. I'm not using it with a nuclear warhead, but I can because I've tweaked my nuclear policy also." So it's a message. So
Yeah.
so we live in a world where missiles are basically saying something rather than doing something.
It's quite weird, how the two of us managed to talk about ICBMs and destruction and nuclear warfare with a smile on our faces
Yeah,
and
yeah,
laughter in
yeah,
our
yeah.
voices.
Yeah.
But that's our job, and I think that's the reason our listeners and our viewers keep coming to us. And apart from the sort of banter we have at times, we do obviously talk serious stuff. And this episode, once again, like always, was great. Lots of fun once again. So thanks, Shiv, as always.
Thanks.
Thanks to our producer as always as well, and our Priyadarshini, and to all our viewers and listeners who keep commenting and who keep giving us ideas and who keep leaving us great feedback. Great feedback, Shiv. By the way, you should really go out and watch our comments. On
Comments,
YouTube.
yeah. I do often on,
Yeah. So thanks to our listeners and viewers. That's it for this week's Defense Dose. For more, tune in next week. Till then, stay safe and do not cross any boundaries with passport. Bye bye.